Today we examine an area that I'd never really considered, employment-related fraud. My guest today is Michael Harrington. Michael was appointed Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Labor by Governor Phil Scott in January of 2017. He became the interim commissioner about a year ago, and then this past June was appointed full-time commissioner. He's a native of Bennington, and so we have another native Vermonter, and he served in a variety of private and public capacity roles in the community. He was educated in Bennington and then moved across the border for his college education to SUNY Plattsburgh, where he received his bachelor's and his master's degrees. And he was named a Vermont Rising Star in 2013. So welcome, Mike, and very happy to have you here with us.
Great. Thanks, Elliott. Happy to be here and happy to share with your listening audience kind of what's going on.
The topic here is fraud in the labor realm, and I'm assuming that we've probably seen some upticks in this over the past several months with the pandemic. So if you could just give us a rundown, is there a problem in Vermont that you're seeing?
So I think it's important to note that fraud happens all the time. There are many different types of fraud that happen. For the purposes of this show, we're really talking about three types of fraud. One is what we call claimant fraud, which is someone who's filing for benefits and giving misinformation to make themselves eligible for benefits. Another may be an employer type of fraud, but more specifically, that's around misclassification of employees. Again, you know, whether that's intentional or not, but if we're looking at the fraud piece, that's specific to people who classify employees as independent contractors and such to avoid paying unemployment insurance taxes on those. But actually what we're really seeing across the country at this point is this third type of fraud, which it goes by the moniker of imposter fraud. And the imposter fraud is where we are seeing a lot of stolen identities of individuals that may have been stolen at various periods in past years and held on to for a while and then resold on the black market and then used during times of strain on the system because it's easier to commit fraud during those periods. And so what we're seeing is people who have obtained somebody's identity and are using that identity to get unemployment insurance benefits. So to your question about whether fraud is something we have to worry about here, I would say yes. It is something that happens in our state. However, I think we're in a very different situation than many other states, especially many large states. So ours is on a much different scale than, say, a state like the state of Washington or California or New York or some of these other states where we've seen hundreds of thousands of fraudulent filings. In our state, it's a much smaller number and really focused on these three areas, but predominantly the imposter fraud is what we're focusing our mitigation efforts on right now and trying to combat this type of fraud.
What would an employee fraud look like to your department?
Yeah, I think employee fraud is more commonly known to us as claimant fraud, right? So it's somebody that has become unemployed or detached from their employer and is now filing for benefits. And again, you know, I also want to point out when we're talking about fraud specifically, you know, we're really talking about intentional fraud, right? So there may be those claimants that inadvertently select an option on an application or believe they're answering truthfully to a question, but later come to find out that that information, that the selection or choice they selected on their application was wrong. And so really, as we're talking here today, I want to focus more on those people who are intentionally seeking to receive benefits even though they're not eligible. And that can be a number of different things. So when someone files an application, they first open an unemployment application, and then they have to file for each week that they're unemployed and want to receive benefits. During that time, they have to attest to a variety of different data points or pieces of information, right? So the most common one is, did I quit or was I fired? In many cases, individuals will indicate they were terminated, and that would essentially make them pass the first hurdle of being eligible for benefits. However, there's always that opportunity for the employer to contest that claim and say, no, this person, was not terminated, they actually quit. But then there are other points throughout the application process where they might have to attest to whether or not they're receiving other types of financial benefits. So are they receiving severance? Did they receive vacation pay? Are there other types of remuneration or workers' compensation benefits that they're receiving, which could offset their unemployment claim? Again, in many cases, what we find is that people will say that they're not receiving these additional benefits or these additional wages. And again, that would make them eligible for more benefits. And when we come to find out later on in life that maybe they misrepresented a fact on their application. And then what we also see are people who are continuing to be employed, whether it's in a legitimate job or it's, what we typically hear of as under the table, right? And so are they continuing to work and receive compensation while also receiving benefits? And so there's this double dipping that's going on.
You're not talking about, for instance, accrued vacation leave that a person is paid for?
Correct, except if they are paid out in a lump sum, there is an offset that has to happen for that time or for the monies they receive. Same with if they received a severance or some type of bonus or something at the end of their employment. Those are considered wages and would offset their benefit amount. When we look at the whole world of what we have out there for intentional fraud, it certainly happens on a regular basis, but like I mentioned earlier, it's not to the scale of some of these other larger states. And many times I would say that, the cases of where someone legitimately knew what they were doing and did it intentionally to receive benefits is much less than when someone believes they're answering the question appropriately or makes a mistake. Again, it's very hard because like an onion, there are many different layers to fraud, as I'm sure you are aware.
Kind of like a misfeasance versus malfeasance situation.
Yes, correct.
Our second area was employer fraud, and I'm not quite sure how that takes place.
Yeah, and again, I don't know whether or not we would call it, I'm not sure we determine it as fraud. Certainly I think to the general public, they could see this as fraud, but it's commonly referred to as misclassification of employees. So if you have someone who's classified as an employee of your business, you pay an unemployment insurance tax or contribution on that employee. Should they become terminated or displaced from their place of employment, they may be eligible for unemployment insurance benefits depending on the circumstances. And employers have to pay this contribution on each of their employees. What we find, though, is that many times our determination or assessment of the law is different from an employer's assessment of the law in terms of whether they believe someone is an employee versus an independent contractor. And many times I think where we see that are, cosmetology and hair salons, or a situation where you might have a general contractor who has subcontractors. Again, there are many different circumstances, but if I'm a general contractor and I bring someone in to do drywall, is drywall part of the normal course of my business as a general contractor, in which case I'm hiring someone to do work that I would normally perform. Therefore, they may be an employee. However, if I'm a general contractor and I hire someone to come in and do something that requires a special certification like electrical work or plumbing, they would be maybe an independent contractor, or some other very unique and specific type of task, not typically associated with my normal duties. And so again, it's more of an interpretation of the law, or a difference in interpretation.
Okay.
And what ends up happening is the department conducts an audit of that business, and we determine that, of the 10 employees you had and the 5 independent contractors you had, we actually believe you had 12 employees and 3 independent contractors. Right. And so then there's a determination that's made, and possibly, some type of fine or penalty, or a repayment of contribution that didn't occur. And certainly during this process, the employer has the ability to appeal a determination and follow the appeal process, again, affording due process to everybody in this. So again, that's kind of falls under the employment or employer fraud, or in this case, misclassification.
In doing my research for meeting with you, one of the things that came up was fictitious employees. And I'm not quite sure how that would benefit an employer.
So it's a great question. And, whether I'm qualified to answer that, or even it may go a level deeper to our general counsel, but at times there may be fictitious employees that help a business qualify, so it's not a sole proprietorship, that it may fall under a corporation. I think fictitious employees, it really depends on how the fictitious employee is set up in the business, and is it funds that you're showing are as an expense on your payroll, and how do those payments come back to you later on? So I think there's a couple of different areas there that would fall under that.
We've kind of saved the best for last on the 3, and that's the third party. And you gave us a little bit of info on what's happening. And I guess, you did mention identity theft. And how does that relate to one's employment?
So it typically doesn't necessarily directly relate to their employment, but I think we've all heard, if you look back over the last 5 years, there's been some major data breaches across the country and across the globe, whether it's the Equifax data breach, or the Target data breach, or Macy's even. I mean, I think probably at some point in our lives, we've received a letter in the mail that says, we're just calling to let you know that your information may have fallen into the hands of someone it wasn't supposed to, and we'll let you know if we believe that we can confirm that or not. I think unfortunately in this world with digital footprints and the use of credit cards and online ordering, there is unfortunately the capturing of people's personal financial information happening all the time. What we are seeing is, there are 2 types of fraud under this premise. One might be that if I'm unemployed and I'm filing for benefits through the Vermont Department of Labor, and I'm a legitimate person and I've truly been laid off, we might have what's called a piggyback type of scenario where you, Elliott, as the fraudster, come in on my claim. And so maybe you found out what my social security number was, and because you have my social security number, you could maybe guess what my PIN number is, right? So maybe I use the last 4 of my social for my PIN, or maybe I use some really easy number for my PIN. And so you log in as me, and the system believes that it's me logging in, and maybe you change my bank account information so the next time I file for benefits, instead of me receiving the check or receiving the direct deposit,
Comes to me.
So that's one way. And then the other way is I simply grabbed, maybe I'm the fraudster this time. Elliott, you're the employee. You're still fully employed. You're not unemployed in any way, shape, or form, but I got your information. Maybe through some other data breach. What we have heard from our federal law enforcement partners is that many times this information that's gained through a data breach is actually held onto for a number of years until there's some major disruption in the system, and then the people who illegally obtain that information sell it on the open market because they can't keep up with all the fraud that's going on because there's so much chaos in the system. And so committing fraud is much easier. And so they'll sell it for a premium, and that person now takes my, I as the fraudster take Elliott's information. I have your name, I have your social security number, I have your date of birth, I have your mailing address, I may have your phone number. And in some cases, I even know what your driver's license number is. And what we've actually found is that in some cases, the fraudster has been able to obtain a picture of your driver's license, right? And so they're actually go into our system and file as Elliott and are able, but the two pieces of information I change in the system might be your bank account information so that it goes to my bank account instead of your bank account. And I might put in a dummy email address so that if the department tries to contact you, they're actually contacting me. So I can, if they send you a link to validate your account, that link now goes to the fraudster instead of to the true individual. So we've all heard about places like the state of Washington, which had hundreds of thousands of these claims come in, or New York or California or Texas, some of these large states. I believe Maryland was another one where we just saw massive amounts of these imposter claims come in. And here in Vermont, it has occurred. I will tell you that prior to COVID-19, we were maybe handling 1 or 2 cases of imposter fraud a year. And I would say in the past, probably 6 to 8 months, we're certainly in the hundreds, if not thousands, but we're not in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands like many other states.
But certainly is a ballooning of this. And unlike the other 2 categories of employee and employer, where you're dealing with somebody generally who's right here.
Right.
Tracking them down is not that hard, whereas with this particular area, person could be in Hong Kong.
Correct.
Or anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and I think the other piece too is this type of fraud is so much harder to detect because literally all the information on the claim is accurate, right? So it's not like they've made up a social security number. They didn't make up a name. They literally pulled real names, real socials, real dates of birth, right? So every data point that we would typically cross-check, it actually comes back as being, yes, this social security number does belong to this person, or this date of birth does belong to this person. And so then you're trying to find the needle in the haystack in terms of what is the little piece of information that might be faulty in this case to identify it as a fraudulent claim. There's some indication too of what we're seeing both here in the state but across the country that the fraudster, it's likely that the information they've gathered probably came from some financial institution, right? So it probably came from a bank or Equifax where they have your credit information, or a credit card company, because what we're finding too is that in the unemployment insurance world, the more you make for your income, the more benefits you're awarded. Right. So if I have a higher income, I earn more benefits. So they're actually targeting people who had a higher income amount because they want to maximize their fraud. And so they're looking at high wage earners in order to make sure that they're getting the maximum benefit amount that can be paid out.
Yeah, we actually have a term for it, whaling, as opposed to fishing.
That's a good one. Yeah, so whaling is a great term. So
Yeah.
we are seeing more of that as well, which, you know, certainly gives some indication of where the information's coming from.
Well, let's look at the next area for discussion, which is what can somebody do, in particular an unemployment insurance claimant, what can you do to minimize the fraud that could be taking place in your name?
Yeah, so certainly monitoring your bank accounts, and that is always a good piece of information. I can tell you, just this isn't related to unemployment insurance, but even I, seeing what was going on in the country for the first time, also put a security freeze on my credit accounts. And you can do that through the three main credit companies because there is just so much fraud and information floating around out there. You know, one of the, I don't want to say it's a blessing because it's probably a blessing and a curse, but, you know, unemployment fraud does not directly impact an individual's credit score, right? So where you may be worried about somebody opening a credit card in your name or taking out a loan in your name and defaulting on that loan and having it attached to your name and impacting your credit score and ability to get you know, to take out a loan of some kind in the future. In UI, we don't necessarily play in that same world. However, you know, and typically if we can validate that you are who you say you are and you are not part of that fraudulent activity, we don't hold the claimant liable in those circumstances. But certainly monitoring your bank accounts and your credit card statements, certainly monitoring, you know, sometimes a fraudster will actually use a real email address or a real phone number or a real mailing address. So constantly monitoring your mailbox at home. If the department's sending you letters, constantly checking your email address to make sure the department's, you know, not emailing you, or, you know, answering the phone call, even if it's a Vermont number, you know, so that, you know, and you may think it's, you know, some spam call or something, but it may be the Department of Labor checking in. You know, we do our best to monitor and reach out to people to validate identities. We do have a fraud team that is specifically focused on identifying fraudulent claims, contacting the true owner of that information, and pointing them in the direction of where they could also go to report the fraud. You know, unfortunately, a lot of people we come in contact with want to know what we're going to do to fix this for them. And there's very little that the department itself can do. Certainly we can work on the claim aspect. So if there was a fraudulent claim made in someone's name, we can work to remove that from their account and find out who the fraud, you know, do our best to find out who the fraudster was and work with local law enforcement and even federal law enforcement in some cases. You know, but really the actual breach of data likely came from somewhere else other than the department. So, you know, it is incumbent upon the claimant to you know, use the tools that are at their disposal, whether it's contacting law enforcement, whether it's freezing their credit accounts. You know, there is a place on the federal website where you can report identity theft. You know, those are all tools and places where people can go. I would also say, you know, people, if they go to our website, we do have a page dedicated to fraud and fraud mitigation. And so there is a place for people to find out more information about how to combat fraud. I would also say just please reach out to us. So even if there's something minor, but it's something that is of interest or catches your attention either on your claim or in your mail, you can always call us and report fraud or report suspicious activity, and we'll work with you to make sure that we're mitigating whatever the issue is, or trying to work through whatever the piece of information that caught your attention was.
And we're going to be displaying on screen the website, which is labor.vermont.gov/UI-fraud. We'll also have the longer suspicious UI account activity website available, as well as the phone numbers for you and for the FTC and the Vermont Attorney General's office. So hopefully the resources will trigger some people to take action if they feel they're victims in this. But we try to tell people, report it. Don't feel that you're threatened. Don't feel that you're stupid. Report it, because you may save yourself and others in the process.
And certainly, like you said, don't feel embarrassed. I mean, the best news that we can come across is when someone reports something, and if it turns out to be nothing, that's great news, right? So, I mean, that's news we love to share with people, as opposed to sharing the bad news that maybe their intuition was correct.
Just as a kind of supplement, recently the access to credit reports has been opened up quite a bit, where it used to be you could get one copy from each of the credit bureaus. As a Vermonter, you could get two from each credit bureau. At this point, until April, you can get a credit report every week from annualcreditreport.com, which is the officially sanctioned website. So we urge people to do that. And for Vermonters, we also say you need to contact the credit bureau in Novus. Novus happens to be the credit bureau used by many credit unions, including Vermont State Employees Credit Union. So just a couple side points. We've covered a lot of information. You gave us some good suggestions on how to proceed and what people can do to protect themselves. Closing comments.
Certainly, as it relates to fraud, I think, we always presume someone is innocent in a case unless we can prove otherwise. I think as we're talking about imposter fraud, certainly in those cases, having people be vigilant. Certainly don't be afraid if someone from the Department of Labor calls you and wants to confirm your information. That's us doing our due diligence. And, if everything works out fine, then, the claim will move through as normal. However, in many cases, when we pick up on some type of suspicious activity, we're contacting individuals and it's the first they've heard of it. And they're saying, I never filed for benefits. And that allows us to put an immediate stop on the claim to make sure payment doesn't go out the door. As you said, many of these claimants, these fictitious claimants, are in a land far, far away, and the likelihood of ever getting that money back is far and few between. So again, I would encourage people, certainly be vigilant, pay attention, monitor your accounts, monitor your mail, and certainly report anything that you think is suspicious. We'd rather provide you with good news than bad news. And so, even if you're just being extra vigilant, that's perfectly fine by us. And certainly, we will do everything that we can to stop the fraud early and as often as possible. But we need people's help to be able to do that. So, thank you in advance to everybody for being vigilant during this time.
Oh. Thank you, Michael Harrington, Vermont Commissioner of Labor. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully, we'll have a chance to revisit at some time in the future and see if there are any bright spots to report, as well as any cautions that maybe we need to restate. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Elliott. Always happy to come back. So thank you.
You're welcome.